Welcome. My name is Karen Gastrike, and today I would like to talk to you about the work that I have been doing with some of my students from Avila University and collaborators from Kansas City Wildlands, KC Parks, and the Missouri Department of Conservation. Kansas City is located at the junction between the Kansas and the Missouri rivers. These lands are the traditional lands of the Oto, Missouri, Osage, Kaw, Sioux, and Kickapoo peoples. This is also the ancestral home of the Potawatomi, Delaware, Wyandot, and Shawnee. We honor and express gratitude for the ancestral people who were on this land before us. I mentioned my collaborators up front. I'd like to take a moment to return to KC Wildlands Bridging the Gap in a little more detail. This is the primary organization responsible for restoring and managing natural habitat in the Kansas City area. It's primarily a volunteer organization that works in collaboration with KC Parks and the Missouri Department of Conservation. KC Wildlands manages several natural habitats across the KC Metro. I'll be talking about two of these during this presentation, both of them located at Jerry Smith Park in the south part of the city. Here are two images showing how Jerry Smith Park is situated inside the urban landscape. On the left, you can see that Jerry Smith Park is located inside a substantial green corridor. This is the Blue River Greenway. To the east of this greenway and to the west of this greenway, we have quite a bit of urbanization, both residential and commercial. The photo on the right, on the lower right, is a close-up of Jerry Smith Park with the borders in red. You can see that there is a mix of woodland and grassland habitats inside the park. This is representative of the type of patchwork landscape that characterized the Kansas City region prior to European settlement. The prairie remnants that I work with are Jerry Smith East here on the far east end of the park, which is considered a remnant prairie, according to the information that we have, intact since pre-settlement times, and Jerry Smith West on the west side of the park, which was restored, reconstructed through aggressive removal of woody growth, burning, and reseeding in 1988. The focus of my work within these habitats has been native bees. Native bees provide vital services as pollinators for both natural and managed ecosystems, including agricultural ecosystems. They face multiple threats, including habitat destruction, pesticide use, and introduced pathogens. We have about 4,000 species of native bees across North America, and within the state of Missouri, an estimated 400 native bee species. At the sites that we've been working on in Kansas City, we've identified about 100 native species and about 100 native bee species to date. For prairie bees, large landscapes are certainly important, but small remnants may also support diverse communities. And we have some evidence from other studies to date that small remnants can play an important role in conserving bee communities. So we wanted to take a close look at this and get a feel for whether the bee communities of these small remnant habitats in the urban landscape of Kansas City were supporting any communities of note in a stable fashion. These are the primary objectives that I have developed with KC Wildlands, MDC, and KC Parks for our work on native bees in the metropolitan area. For the remainder of the talk, I will be focusing on the first two of these three objectives, the initiation of long-term monitoring of native bees and what that has told us so far about these prairie remnants, and the effort to identify practices that will better support wild bees in managed habitats. One of the first studies we did was to compare native bee communities in urban prairies and organic gardens. We spent a lot of time talking about the urban prairies at Jerry Smith Park, but there are many other habitats in the urban landscape that native bees can take advantage of. So during the first year that we began our monitoring of native bee communities at Jerry Smith Park, we decided to compare those communities with organic gardens embedded in residential areas in Jackson County. The results from this first set of surveys were quite interesting. Abundance, as indicated by encounter rates during our collection periods, was higher, much higher on urban prairies compared to organic gardens. However, diversity, as indicated by both the Simpson's Diversity Index and the Shannon Diversity Index, while high in both habitats, tended to be lower in urban prairies. This was because a certain set of species tended to be quite dominant on urban prairies. Whereas in organic gardens, all the species that we encountered, or most of the species we encountered, were more or less equally represented. When looking at the composition of the communities in prairies versus garden sites, we saw some differences. Almost half of the species that we identified were found only on the urban prairies, while a quarter of the species that we identified were found only at garden sites. So while there was some overlap between the communities in these two habitats, they were also quite distinct. Finally, species of apidae tended to be much more common on prairies, but rare in gardens. And I will come back to this in the next slide. Having seen the importance that these urban prairies have for several species of apids, we wanted to take a closer look at this group going into the second year of our monitoring. Apidae is the largest family of bees, and they, as I mentioned, include bumblebees, species of bombus. Many apids are ground nesters. They depend on permeable surfaces in order to make their nests, and this is one of the reasons why we believe grasslands are such an important habitat for these bees, especially in the context of an urban landscape. For this study, we repeated the methodology used in the previous study going into the season of 2019, and then we compared diversity and abundance between remnant and reconstructed sites to get a feel for how the apid communities are represented in remnant versus reconstructed prairie at Jerry Smith Park. A brief overview of our results. We've seen no difference in abundance across those 2 years of our bumblebee species. Our species richness for bumblebees, however, is higher in remnant prairie. And diversity, as measured by the Simpson Index, is also higher in our remnant prairie, Jerry Smith East, as compared to Jerry Smith West. If we pull the camera back a little bit and look at the family Apidae as a whole, we're seeing no difference in abundance or diversity across the years and the sites. Within these numbers, the community composition is not static, as you might imagine. These communities are quite dynamic, but nonetheless, overall abundance and diversity appears to be constant across years and across sites at the family level. Before wrapping up, I want to mention just briefly a project we're starting this summer looking at stem nesters in small prairie remnants. Managing for stem nesters presents a particular challenge in these small prairie remnants because, as their name implies, these bees lay their eggs in dry twigs and stems. So burning the prairie, which you must do when managing a prairie environment, tends to burn the eggs and larvae of these bees as well. In response to this challenge, this year Missouri Department of Conservation established what we're calling stem nester refugia in Jerry Smith East. And so we will be working with them starting this year and going into the future to look specifically at this guild of bees and see if the maintenance of these areas, which will be left unburnt during burning periods, will allow recuperation of stem nester populations in these sites. Okay, to summarize this all in one slide, small spaces matter. Urban grasslands can support stable and diverse communities of native pollinators. In addition, different urban habitats support different communities of bees. This is particularly important to keep in mind when considering the role of the urban landscape and especially residential areas in native bee conservation. Finally, stability in numbers and diversity can mask underlying shifts and differences in community composition, which should be taken into account when considering the conservation of target species. Before I wrap up, a quick acknowledgments for all of our collaborators and the support that we've received. And I am happy to address any questions during discussion or during the rest of the conference. Thank you for listening.